And we're we're live streaming on Facebook Live, and also the session will be available on our YouTube channel, which is what Kristen was doing. Thanks for coming out to this lecture at the Evanston History Center. Is this anyone's first time at the Dawes House? A couple of you. That's fantastic. Thanks so much. The Evanston History, my name is Krista. I'm the Director of Public Engagement here. I'm with Larry Latouret, who I will introduce further in a moment. Welcome to the Evanston History Center. We are grateful to be in this beautiful historic home of Charles Dawes. I know many of you, we had some conversations and you learned a bit before the talk, but I'll just mention that this was the home of Charles Dawes from about 1909 to the 1950s. He was vice president under Calvin Coolidge. Charles Dawes was a Nobel Peace Prize winner. He was ambassador to the United Kingdom. He had a top 10 music hit and other extraordinary accomplishments. And if you're interested in seeing more about the house, we do have house tours. We're open on Thursdays through Sunday, and we do tours at 2 p.m. if you're interested in a more in-depth tour from one of our historians and learning a lot about both Charles Dawes and the home. We also recognize that the land this house is built on has a rich history that goes back much further than Charles Dawes. We honor this history and we remember it as we use this house for our programs of the Evanston History Center. With that, we recognize that the land that this house is built on is the unceded ancestral lands of the Potawatomi, the Ojibwe, and the Odawa peoples. We recognize the privilege inherent with the wealth of this house, its previous owner, and this beautiful lakefront property, and how that relates to whose stories are remembered and told, or conversely, erased from history because of the colonialism and racism that exists to this day. As the Evanston History Center, even though we're based in the home of one prominent Evanstonian, we are committed to honoring and highlighting the stories of all of the peoples of Evanston, past and present. We take seriously our role in making sure all stories and perspectives are valued, and through exploration and dialogue, we all continue learning together. So I can assume that we all know and agree that Evanston is a pretty cool and interesting place, right? And so at the Evanston History Center, we're always looking for interesting Evanstonian stories to share. So when Larry Latouret approached us about a talk that had to do with football, but it also involved feminism and a kind of interesting but shady character, we were like, that's definitely a story that we'd like to do here. So this evening's talk is Gus Hornsby and Evanston's role in the birth of American football. And I am pleased to now formally introduce Larry Latouret. Larry is a consumer insights and marketing analytics expert. He holds a master's degree in social anthropology from Northwestern. In terms of writing, for over 20 years, he has pursued historical research exploring the roots of American football and the people who brought it to us. So tonight's talk is going to be a kind of Evanstonian slant on the book that I also mentioned he will be selling afterwards. And Larry is currently working on / finished with a new work of satirical historical fiction entitled Florence. So Larry, thank you so much for being here, and I will give it to you.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Kristen. Thanks, Kristen, and everyone else at the Evanston History Center. I'm really honored to be here tonight, and I thank all of you for coming out on an odd, snowy, rainy evening. This is by far the most aesthetically pleasing venue I've ever had the honor to speak in, so this is as much a thrill for me as anyone else. So as Kristen mentioned, this is a talk about a person named Gus Hornsby, and my book is a biography of this interesting individual who is an immigrant from England. He was an officer in the English Army, and he brought American football to the Midwest for the first time. So we'll be talking about him. We'll also be talking about the obscure and somewhat important game of football that was played here at Evanston. Again, the very first game of American football ever played in the Midwest. Before then, American football had only been played on the East Coast. And not only that, this was only the second American football game ever that really resembled what we know of as football. And we'll get into that in just a minute. So we'll be talking about Hornsby, Evanston, Krista had also mentioned first wave American feminism. There's a lot going on. So I'm going to try to pack that all into the next 50 or so minutes. There will be time for Q&A at the end, but if you have questions that just can't wait, interrupt me, let me know, and we can take it from there. So as I had mentioned, we're going to be talking about that first football game, and that was played by a team imaginatively called the Chicago Football Club. So we're going to be talking about the history of that team and step back and kind of talk about the evolution of football. So if you're not a fan of football, you can play with Tinker Toys upstairs, you can tune out for a while, but I think it's important just to see how that evolved and the importance of this game in Evanston to the sport. We'll also be talking again about Northwestern, Evanston, and the feminist movement and how that strangely ties in to this game. We'll wrap up by talking a little bit about the life of Gus Hornsby. Since this is an author lecture, we'll wrap it up with a very brief reading from Gus Hornsby's Gamble. So without further ado, let's talk about the Chicago Football Club and its origin here in Evanston. And to do that, we need to talk again about how American football came to be. So that game in Evanston took place in February 1876. Took place on the Northwestern campus, and it was only 7 years after the first game of football took place. Usually, historians recognize the 1869 game between Rutgers and Princeton as the first game of American football. And this is, there were no photos of that particular game. This is a drawing that came a couple years later, and some things to point out immediately about this game. First of all, notice all of the players are in shirt sleeves, or in essentially street clothes. The ball is perfectly spherical, and you'll notice they are all kicking the ball. If we went into a time machine and went back to this game and watched this game, you would swear you were watching soccer. It was a game very, very close to association football or soccer. There were some kinks that they had made, some changes that the East Coast colleges had made, but it was still very much a kicking game. And that kind of kicking game actually has its roots centuries before this. If we look back, kicking games have been played in China, in the Western Hemisphere, and in Europe for hundreds and hundreds of years. These were common, just to kick a ball or a human head in some cases, a bunch of other different objects around. In Europe, this eventually gave way to something known as folk or village football. And this took hold in parts of North and Central Europe during the Middle Ages, and it got weird. In some cases, some of these village games of football can involve literally the entire village. Hundreds of people playing, and there were no real rules. Sometimes they would make up rules on the fly. Sometimes it was how fast could we kick the ball across the village. Sometimes it was a game of keep away. Sometimes it was just an excuse to riot and let off steam. And that kind of rules-free kicking football actually followed some of the Europeans to the colonies, to America, and we actually have examples throughout the Midwest, throughout the East Coast of people playing this kind of kicking game, even in Chicago. The first recorded game of football in Chicago was a rules-free kicking game right after the Civil War. So it took hold. It took hold especially in Europe and the Americas, and ultimately it gave way to versions with rules. Some of those still exist. Some of them are pretty obscure. One such example, I don't know if you could see this little illustration, but there was actually a game that in England at Eton College called the wall game, and they literally played kicking football against a wall. Not the safest sport, and for some reason it didn't catch on. But weirdly, this game is still played at Eton College. You could still go there and see people play the wall game. Obviously, there were other versions that came to be, including, hey, football with goals, trying to actually kick the ball into a goal. And it's pretty obvious that this gave way to modern football. It was called in England association football, and the associations would rise, they would play this game. The reason initially that it was called football was to distinguish it from polo or other games played on horseback. You were literally running around on your feet, football. For the English, they began calling it association football more and more. Sometimes that would be shortened to socier. And in the English vernacular, socier eventually became soccer. So that's how that word, ironically, they don't call it that, only we do in the United States, but that is the origin of soccer. So that really took root in England, and they began playing it in the United States as well. Another version of football originated in rugby at the rugby school in the early 1820s, and this was the carrying game. You actually got to carry the football finally. That came after association football, but the rules for rugby were codified pretty quickly. So that's actually a really old game, and it's almost identical, modern rugby, to the rugby they were playing in the 1800s. Both of these versions of football, the kicking association football and the carrying rugby football, ultimately came to the United States, and East Coast schools began playing them, and they started to add their own twist to them. So more and more you see both of these versions mutate and become distinctly American. So it was this version that Princeton and Rutgers played. Yale eventually started to play this version as well. In Boston, a lot of Boston school children were descended from English immigrants and Irish immigrants. They played rugby. And a lot of those Boston school children went to college at Harvard. So Harvard began playing its own version of rugby, and they pretty significantly changed the rules. It became known as the Harvard game or the Boston game of American football. So now we have two competing versions of American football. By 1869 even, when Rutgers and Princeton were playing, you still had folks in the Boston area playing a rugby style of American football. Gus Hornsby grew up in England. He was very familiar with rugby. He actually learned rugby from the headmaster of the rugby school in the early 1850s. So he was one of the first to really have that game down. When he immigrated to the United States, he spent time on the East Coast before coming to Chicago, and he was quite aware of both of these versions of American football, and they intrigued him. He was especially intrigued by the Boston game because it so resembled the English rugby that he was playing. When Hornsby came to Chicago, he became one of the first sports journalists in America. This was in 1873, and he began writing for a brand new publication called Field and Stream. And as he was writing, he kept in contact with these schools on the East Coast. In 1875, just 2 years after Hornsby came to the United States, Harvard and Yale wanted to play a game of football. They could not agree on which version to play. So they had a meeting of the minds, and they put together a brand new mutated game called the concession game or concessionary game, and it had the concessionary rules of American football. Harvard won that game in November of 1875. Not only did Harvard win the game, Harvard won the War of Rules, and this is critical. Almost all of the rules for this concessionary game came from Harvard's rugby-style American football. If Yale had gotten its way, the NFL would be very different right now. It would almost be like a full-contact soccer. This was a pivotal point, and that happened in November of 1875. Gus Hornsby already knew about it. Hornsby had actually written and had gotten a copy of the rules that summer when Yale and Harvard agreed to them. So by October of 1875, a month before this game, Hornsby was already trying to field a team in Chicago to play the concessionary rules of American football that no one had ever played before. You'll notice that in this image, this is actually a cropped image from the football program that was distributed during the Harvard-Yale game. And the ball is spherical. That is one of the few things that Yale got its way with. They didn't play with a rugby ball. They played with a spherical soccer ball. But they played rugby style with that ball. Hornsby did not like that. Hornsby sent away, got a rugby ball, and what eventually happened is when we had the first game of American football here, it was the first game played with these new rules and with an actual football, and that was in Evanston. Eventually, of course, this became modern football as epitomized by the Chicago Bears. So it's late October 1875. Hornsby has the rules that he wants to use in Chicago. He has the ball he wants to use. He doesn't have a team. So he tries to recruit a team. And one person hears about his request in Chicago, and that's the one person who could have actually helped him raise a team. And that person was William Buckingham Curtis. This incredibly sideburns, topless gentleman is William Buckingham Curtis. This is a picture of Curtis with the New York Athletic Club in 1876. Curtis founded the New York Athletic Club. He co-founded the Chicago Athletic Club, which of course still exists. And Curtis was enormously wealthy. He spent his time shuttling between New York and Chicago. He was in Chicago in the fall of '75, heard Hornsby's request, and he began recruiting people immediately. Now, the athletic clubs in the 1870s are a little different from a lot of athletic groups now, where athleticism is important. Here, these were social clubs. These are people who had, before the Civil War, were members of the Masonic lodges and other places to show their status in society. After the Civil War, there was a need to show that you were a member of the leisure class. So yachting clubs became very popular after the Civil War. Athletic clubs did too. And these were the cream of the social crop. These are people who, by attending these, said, I don't have to work. Part of the leisure class. Yes?
Can you talk about their footwear? Is that like what they wore to play football?
These slippers... These slippers actually are usually wrestling, tug of war, things like that. Interesting you call that out because William Curtis actually imported from England cleats. It was the first time American athletes had ever worn cleated footwear, and he brought them over, had the New York Athletic Club wear them, and the Chicago Football Club ultimately had cleated footwear, and they wore cleats in the game in Evanston. The Northwestern students they played against did not. The Northwestern students were at a considerable disadvantage when it came to uniforms and equipment. But no, these were not the shoes they would wear for football.
And what about the medals on their chest?
These particular individuals had all won some sort of national award in athletics. So this was the New York Athletic Club showing off their wares, showing off their national champions in this photo. That's a good question. So again, most of the people who joined this very first team, the Chicago Football Club, were members of high society, including, and I'll point out a couple of them, this person, John Jeffrey. John Jeffrey owned a couple of newspapers in Chicago, and his claim to fame is he radically altered journalism in Chicago and throughout the United States. He popularized the splash headline. Before John Jeffrey, most headlines were very, very small font, but Jeffrey, especially in 1871, began using large headlines, tabloid headlines. An example of that would be this one, The Great Calamity of the Age. I think you can guess what story this was. This was the 1871 Chicago fire, but Chicago in ashes, 2 exclamation marks, very bold. So he was one of the founding members of the club. Another person who William Curtis and Hornsby got to sign up for that first one was this person who owned and managed a couple of hotels in the Chicago area. His name might be familiar. This is Charles Hilton, who was a member of the Chicago football team. Another person on this team, this is his Baseball Hall of Fame plaque, was William Holbert. William Holbert was associated with the Chicago Cubs at the time. Back then, they were the Chicago White Stockings, a little confusing. Chicago White Stockings became the Chicago Cubs, and he was not a player. He was the owner of the Chicago Cubs in 1876. Holbert did not actually play in the first football game. He had to skip that because at the time he was in New York City founding the National League for Major League Baseball. But he was one of the first members of the team. Also on that first Chicago Football Club team was an Evanstonian by the name of Walter Brown. And Walter Brown was an interesting guy. He was a polymath. He was the foremost American expert on metallurgy, wrote a book about metallurgy, and he was also an expert on Marcus Aurelius, and had edited a huge volume on Marcus Aurelius. He had one of the largest rare book collections in the Midwest, and when he died in 1904, he donated that vast library to the Evanston Library here. So interesting connection to Evanston right there. Last person I'd want to point out who was on that first Chicago Football Club team was this young man. And this was a photo that was taken of him just a couple of months after that February 1876 game. He was 19 at the time. Not only was he by far the youngest member of the Chicago Football Club, he was younger than most of the students who played for Northwestern in that game. But he is not famous for athletics. He is famous for architecture. This is Lewis Sullivan. 19-year-old Lewis Sullivan, who was already working hard in Chicago, helping to rebuild after the Chicago fire. And by the way, scored a touchdown. Really athletic guy. Yeah, Lewis Sullivan was a member of that first team. So it was a who's who of high society in Chicago and Evanston. So once they had this team, they got a headquarters. Since they had a number of hotel connections, the football club was housed in the Chicago Tremont Hotel. This is what the Chicago Tremont Hotel looked like a few years before that. It burned to the ground. It was completely destroyed in the fire, but it was such a landmark in Chicago that they rebuilt it almost immediately. This is the Tremont House Hotel after the Chicago fire. This was the headquarters of the brand new Chicago Football Club, and it could not have been a worse location for Gus Hornsby, because the Tremont House Hotel was a hotbed of illegal gambling. And Gus Hornsby was an inveterate gambler, and that fed his habit to no end. So unfortunately for him. The other thing I'd want to point out about this particular hotel is that eventually in the late 1890s, it shut down. Northwestern University, since its founding, had had schools in the downtown Chicago area. And by the turn of the century, Northwestern was looking to consolidate its Chicago campus, and it chose the Tremont House Hotel. This became Northwestern University's Chicago location for 2 decades.
Where is it?
It is now gone. This was just east of State and Randolph, I think. Eventually it was torn down, and that's when Northwestern moved to its current Chicago campus. But a fascinating history of its own in this building. Any other questions as far as just that history of the Chicago Football Club and football itself? All right, let's go to Northwestern and Evanston, and how Northwestern put together a team to battle the Chicago Football Club is itself kind of an interesting journey. So I'd mentioned Charles Hilton, the hotel manager, was part of the Chicago Football Club. He had a cousin who was a student at the time at Northwestern, Theophilus Hilton. Theo Hilton was a senior at the time, and he was not involved in sports, but he had a lot of friends who were involved. So Theo Hilton took the offer to play the Chicago Football Club to the Northwestern University baseball team and to the team's captain, Frank Cassidy. Frank Cassidy, Evanston resident, he was a junior at the time, and he is the one who founded and put together the first Northwestern University football team. Cassidy, seen here on the Northwestern campus, just a few yards away from Sheridan Road. This is the Old Oak, which was a landmark in the 1800s at Northwestern. It's long gone now, but this was Cassidy's class at that time. Another photo here of the class of 1877. Cassidy is right there front and center with his class, and you'll notice this class was co-ed. There are 3 women who are in this class. The Northwestern University started admitting women in 1869. They still have to sit in the back, but there were women in the class of 1877.
One step at a time.
Yeah, and a couple steps back, who knows.
Yeah.
So this is the class of 1877. This was Frank Cassidy, and Cassidy was an exemplary athlete. He was small for his age, but he played baseball great. This is one last photo of Cassidy, and this is cropped from the Northwestern baseball team, and you can see they're wearing their brand new uniforms. This is 1875, just before they start putting together the football team. And the NWU embroidered on these nice, natty uniforms. They're showing off their uniforms and their brand new equipment. And they're also showing off this, which is the Silver Ball Trophy. It's one of the very first athletic trophies in the American Midwest. Northwestern won that in 1875. I point all this out because the uniforms, the equipment, and even the silver trophy were purchased in part through funds given by Frances Willard. Frances Willard funded all of that. Frances Willard was a major force to Northwestern having any kind of athletic program. The Northwestern University administration at this time were lukewarm at best on sports, and they really didn't encourage it. Willard, however, did for a couple of pretty clear reasons. So Willard, of course, was ultimately the head of the WCTU here in Evanston, and was obviously the head of temperance and the temperance movement, which was wanting prohibition from alcohol. But they also were closely tied to women's suffrage. At the time, Susan B. Anthony was the most visible head of suffrage in the United States. But what's interesting is Frances Willard's group, which also was advocating for suffrage, had 10 times the membership of any of the groups that Susan B. Anthony had. They were very, very important in the suffrage movement. And one of the things that Frances Willard wanted very much was to encourage athletics because it gave male college students a diversion from going down to Chicago, going to the pool halls, and drinking. And they reciprocated. They loved Frances Willard, and they loved the suffrage movement. It's amazing how many of the students who were Northwestern football players on this first team ultimately, as adults, became heavily involved in the suffrage movement of the late 19th century and early 20th century. Cassidy himself and his wife would ultimately move to Portland, Oregon, and they would be very active in the women's suffrage movement out there. Another person who was on that first team was from downstate Illinois. That was Edward Kinman. I mention him because, I have a photo of him. But also, he was the captain. Cassidy was busy organizing the team, and he let Kinman be the captain of this first team, and they learned the rules from Hornsby. So the question then was, where would they play? The first thought was that they would play at the Chicago Cubs, or the Chicago White Stockings field, but that was occupied. So they decided to have that first game of football in Evanston. This is an illustration of what Evanston looked like at the time. I think this illustration is from 1875. And by the way, the original version of this illustration is upstairs. I just saw it. It's hanging up there. You can see it in living color. I'd never seen it in color before. But it's fun to look at this, and this is looking south. You can see University Hall. That looks very much the same. This is Chicago Avenue at the time, now called Sheridan Road. And you can see the Evanston Pier near Davis Street, which figures prominently as well. The Chicago Football Club, when they came up to play, actually took a boat and docked it here, and then walked the rest of the way to the campus. This is Heck Hall. Heck Hall is now gone. It is replaced by Deering Library. It burned to the ground in 1914. This area here with these trees, this is right around where Deering Meadow is now. And right where it says Evanston, that is the southern boundary at that time of the football field. Unfortunately, there are no illustrations or photographs that we know of the athletic grounds that Northwestern had in the mid-1870s, right here. But that is where they played. Another much better illustration of Heck Hall. And again, that football field would have started right about here and gone north. So again, here we've got Deering Library, Heck Hall, and the original Northwestern football field, which is right where the Jacob Center is now. Because of construction, later on in 1886, Northwestern moved its football field to Deering Meadow, and it's actually on this meadow where Northwestern and Notre Dame first played in 1889. It was during that 1889 game, allegedly, that Notre Dame got its nickname. They were Catholics. Northwestern were Methodists. There was really bad blood during that game. It was an enormously violent game. A lot of very, very serious injuries, and the Northwestern fans were screaming, "Kill those fighting Irish." So unconfirmed, but that's the story of how Notre Dame got its name. So again, this first game took place in 1876. It took place on a holiday. Intentionally. They put it during the Washington's birthday holiday on February 22nd, 1876. That was a big deal. President Grant, for the first time, had said that that day should be a holiday. It was kind of a dry run for the centennial celebrations that were going to happen in the United States in July. So people were very excited. Evanston did nothing for this. And a lot of residents were upset that Evanston didn't do anything for the holiday. But it meant that the football game was the only game in town. So there were actually several hundred people who witnessed this first football game, and they were not impressed. They had never seen anything like it, and the Evanston Index, the newspaper at the time, called it startling and weird. They thought it was a very strange sport. We have no illustrations of that first game. This particular drawing is pretty close to what that would have looked like, though. And again, a lot of people came, a lot of Evanston residents came to see this, and a lot of high school students. Northwestern at that time had a prep school, Northwestern Academy. That later became Evanston Academy, and it's long gone. But one of the high school students, a sophomore in high school, saw this game from the Northwestern Academy, and that person was William Dyke. And his name might be familiar. This is William Dyke as a high school senior at Northwestern Academy, 2 years after the game. Obviously, he became a mayor in Evanston in the late 1890s and was very, very important to Northwestern athletics. But he was at this game, as was this woman, Jessie Brown. Jessie Brown was at that game for a couple of reasons. First of all, she was an acolyte of Frances Willard. Willard was in Philadelphia at the time. Otherwise, Frances Willard would have been at this game. But she had business in Philadelphia. Jessie Brown instead went. She was a senior at Northwestern at the time. The other reason why Jessie Brown went to this game, she was engaged to Theo Hilton. So after they both graduated, both of them, including Jessie Brown Hilton, became very, very involved in women's suffrage and in the temperance movement. Jessie Brown Hilton ultimately became the national spokesperson for the WCTU. Unfortunately, died only at 40 years old, very, very young. But very, very important to the WTCU's history and Evanston as well. So I had mentioned that this game was attended by a lot of folks. It was in February. It was freezing. And one thing they forgot to do, they forgot to ground the posts, the goal posts. The ground was so hard that they couldn't actually ground them. So Hornsby came up with the idea that they would simply lie on the ground, and if somebody looked like they were going to kick, a couple of designated fans would suddenly rip the posts up and would hold them in place. I'm hopeful that when the new Northwestern Stadium is built, I can get them to revive this tradition and have people holding the posts. But that's what happened. Now, this was a fairly dramatic game just because it was so unusual. And ultimately, the Chicago Football Club won. That's no surprise. They had been practicing for weeks, as opposed to the Northwestern students who really had no idea what was going on. After this game, both teams went to the business district in Evanston and had dinner. This is what the district looked like at that time. This photo was taken later in 1876. We can tell it was later because there is Fountain Square with the original fountain that was installed in July of that year. There was a little bird on the top. I'm sure folks here are aware of that. What I didn't know was that bird is also upstairs. You can actually see the bird that was on top of Fountain Square that was erected here in July of 1876. So that is the first football game. And this was the first American football game, again, played in the Midwest. It's obscure, but it has a long-reaching legacy. One thing to note is that even though Hornsby left this team soon after that. William Curtis kept on trucking. He was still heading up the Chicago Athletic Club, and Curtis continued even after Hornsby left in 1878. He continued to put together football teams, including a lot of all-star teams using East Coast stars from the American football games that were being played there. So Curtis and the Chicago Athletic Club, also splitting off to the Chicago Athletic Association, began putting together these huge all-star games, and these were very popular at the time. So a lot of other athletic groups began switching over to American football because of the work that Curtis was doing with the Chicago Athletic Association. They wanted to play these all-star teams. So you had a ton of high schools, other colleges putting together football teams to play Curtis's teams. And by 1898, you had a group that was also playing these all-star teams, and it was the Morgan Athletic Club. The Morgan Athletic Club eventually changed its name to the Racine Street Athletic Club, and it became known as the Racine Cardinals, and eventually became the Arizona Cardinals, the very first, oldest NFL team. And they started in Chicago.
And then went to St. Louis.
They had quite the trek. Yes, Racine Street, Chicago, then all the way up until what, the 1950s in Chicago, and then yes, they kept on trucking west.
They played in Comiskey, right?
Yes, they did. Yep. And of course, the Bears played in Wrigley. Yeah. So, any questions? And we'll have time at the end to discuss as well. Yeah.
Who's the score of the game?
Scoring is weird. So for this one, there were 3 touchdowns and 3 goals to nothing. So touchdowns and goals were a little separate. It was still sort of like rugby where you could score a touchdown, but really that touchdown gave you the right to kick a goal try from that spot you had scored the touchdown in. Goals were more important. So they had 2 touchdowns that resulted in 2 goals, 1 touchdown that resulted in no goal, and then 1 goal that they just kicked on the fly. So it was 3 touchdowns, 3 goals to 0. Yep. But Northwestern held its own in the second half. It was a close game in the second half. I'll take that. So finally, let's talk a little bit about Hornsby as we wrap up. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so I'm a little confused about which really advanced first, football at the college level or at the professional level, and I'm thinking college first.
College.
By far.
Yeah, especially on the East Coast. Intercollegiate football. If we're talking about American football, intercollegiate.
So,
East Coast colleges.
Okay, admitted bias, I'm a big Michigan fan. All I have in my head is fielding Yost in 1903, and so I want to think the Big Ten got going fairly quickly.
Yeah, 1895 is when they were organized, and their first season was 1896. If you would ask anyone else the first American football game in Chicago, they would say Michigan. Michigan and Racine College. Michigan and Racine College played a game in Chicago in 1879, but this predates that by 3 years.
Right. Just curious, but it definitely took hold at the college level first.
Yeah.
By far.
Oh, yeah. And even when the NFL started, it was second fiddle to college for a long time. Television really changed that. Yep.
Okay.
So Hornsby. Hornsby, very obscure guy. I was researching early football, and one of the reasons why I instead wrote a biography of Hornsby is this is a really interesting character. We only have 4 photographs of Augustus Hornsby. This is Hornsby with his family right around the time of the American Civil War. He was an Army officer, and his life kind of plays out like a 19th century Forrest Gump. He is at the strangest, pivotal points in history. As a child, he went to Wellington College, and he was the very first class, the charter class of Wellington College. It's still there. This is a drawing of Queen Victoria signing the charter for Wellington. Gus Hornsby is one of these boys who are standing in front watching Victoria sign the charter for the school. As I had mentioned at the intro, this school was so new, they had visiting scholars come in to teach them, including the headmaster of nearby Rugby College, and that's where Hornsby learned to play the sport, and he was exceedingly good at it. So he was one of the first English players of rugby, and he was still ultimately an Army officer. He evangelized rugby in the Army. He formed teams in India, he formed teams in Greece, he formed teams in Japan. He was everywhere. And they still play a weird version of rugby in Japan, in the same area where he had taught it. I mentioned he was one of the first people to write for Field and Stream, and continued through the late 1870s. Gambling took its toll. This is an area near Randolph Street in Chicago. It was a hotbed of gambling, and he went heavily into debt. So ultimately, he packed up, tried to find a place where he could get rich quick, and he made it in St. Paul. Hornsby ended up moving to West St. Paul, and the gamble he took there was real estate. There was a real estate boom in St. Paul. He got in on the ground floor, and within a couple of years, he had become fabulously wealthy. He had, within 2 years, put together $250,000. In today's money, it's about $12 million that he had put together pretty quickly. At the same time, he was also gambling wildly and was up a tremendous amount. That came crashing down. In 1890, he began losing money hand over fist. One trip, he went back to Chicago, lost $40,000 in 2 days playing cards at one of the hotels. So ultimately, the real estate bubble burst. He found himself tremendously in debt. His fortune was wiped out. In desperation, he began forging mortgages and deeds to try to give himself some time and some extra cash to get out of his debt. He was discovered, and there was a national manhunt because he fled St. Paul. This made the front page of the New York Times that Hornsby had fled St. Paul. There was a dramatic 6-month manhunt across country for Hornsby. Hornsby had actually doubled back. He was in Chicago, and he was discovered in 1893, and this is true. They found him on the opening day of the Chicago World's Fair in 1893. It's like Devil in the White City, but it really happened. So the chief detective of police in St. Paul came down to get him, and hilarity ensued. He eventually went to prison for several years in Minnesota. While he was in prison, he was jail mates with the Younger gang. So the James gang and Cole and Jim Younger, the Younger brothers had actually been captured within a couple of months of the Chicago football game in 1876. They'd been rotting in a jail cell in Minnesota, and in 1893, here comes Hornsby. Cole and Jim Younger had founded a newspaper, and it turns out they were done with it. They wanted nothing to do with their creation. Hornsby took it over, and Gus Hornsby became the editor of the Stillwater Prison's newspaper. Fascinating. And during his time as editor, by the way, the Prison Mirror, the newspaper, it still is published. It's by far the oldest prison newspaper in the country. And he used it as a mouthpiece for women's rights, for suffrage. It was incredible. Stuff that no other paper was printing at the time. So a fascinating individual. When he finally was released from prison, led a very quiet life in St. Paul. He would occasionally write newspaper pieces comparing his games against Northwestern in the 1870s to games that were modern games that were taking place in the 1920s. And he died in 1929. So that is the life of Augustus Hornsby. And like I had mentioned...
He was just a writer for the Field and Stream? He didn't own it?
No, he was just a journalist for it. Yeah. So I want to finish this since this is, again, an author's lecture with a subject from the book. And for this reading, I want to talk about Hornsby's capture. We've talked a lot about football. Get away from that for a little bit. So this is how Augustus Hornsby was captured and what happened when he was captured. He was captured, by the way, as I had mentioned, by this man, Detective Chief John McGinn, who had come from St. Paul to collect him. McGinn was shocked by Hornsby's physical appearance. He looked to be in very poor health after 6 months on the run and was in a despondent mood. McGinn charged him with second-degree larceny. Hornsby at once denied the charges, but said he was perfectly willing to return to St. Paul. On the evening of April 30th, McGinn booked a double berth in a Burlington Rail sleeping car. The train was mostly unoccupied. Most travelers were moving in the opposite direction that Sunday. They were streaming into Chicago for the World's Fair. President Grover Cleveland was in Chicago that day, and on Monday at noon, he would declare the opening of the Columbian Exposition in an address to the city. McGinn handcuffed himself to Hornsby, who made no effort whatsoever to resist. The private sleeping car was beautiful. Dark jet wood surrounded the windows, plush double-wide seats the color of blood and wine, and a plush string of polished brass chandeliers. The bed was a wide pull-out that occupied the space of 3 of the seats. Despite a couchette-style upper bunk available via a drop chain from the luggage racks, the 2 men slept side by side on the lower bed, still chained together. Early the following morning, on May 1st, the pair rose and left the sleeping car for one of the day coaches. McGinn no longer shackled himself to his prisoner, but Hornsby remained handcuffed. Hornsby was relieved. The car had no fellow travelers that would witness this shame, and it had comfortable cushioned seats. Despite having slept, Hornsby was still exhausted and in bad shape physically. According to Detective McGinn, Hornsby's spirits rose noticeably as the train neared St. Paul. The two began conversing casually. Hornsby asked McGinn to remove his handcuffs so that he could get a glass of water. McGinn agreed, and rather than follow him, simply watched as Hornsby walked to the end of the car to get a drink. Hornsby returned, and McGinn decided not to put the handcuffs back on. Now, in Chicago, at that very moment, President Cleveland stood in front of the Fair's Administration Building. He was before a crowd of thousands at Jackson Park, and he began his speech. At the end of his speech, just after noon, he was to push a special electric button that would activate a massive steam engine connected to the machinery hall. As President Cleveland took his place to speak, the crowd's cheer boomed across the plaza. Women on the platform took out their white handkerchiefs and waved them. We stand today in the presence of the oldest nations of the world, and we point to the great achievements we here exhibit, asking no allowance on the score of youth. We have made and here gathered objects of use and beauty, the product of American skill and invention. We have also made men who rule themselves. Hornsby looked out the window. The countryside streamed past. The Burlington was traveling between 30 and 40 miles per hour. The spring day was overcast, rather cold, just over 40 degrees Fahrenheit. It started to rain slightly. The train sped toward a tiny station in Prescott, Wisconsin. It was on the banks of the Mississippi, near the spot where the Mississippi meets the St. Croix. It was 5 minutes after noon. Hornsby turned to McGinn and asked to go to the water closet. He wanted to get a washcloth to bathe his eyes. McGinn agreed and followed Hornsby down the corridor of the day coach toward the small closet that contained a toilet and a wash basin. McGinn intended to hold the door open for Hornsby, but Hornsby startled him, suddenly lunging forward into the closet. Hornsby violently pivoted and slammed the door and quickly latched it. McGinn stared at the door, momentarily confused. Hornsby, mustering a lifetime of athletic prowess, leapt onto the toilet, grabbed the wooden sash of the window, and jerked it open. McGinn collected himself and aimed a savage blow at the door with his shoulder. The water closet's door proved surprisingly sturdy. Hornsby looked out the window. The train was still cruising along at least 35 miles per hour. Hornsby lifted himself halfway out the window, and a blast of cold, wet air slammed into his face. Hornsby smiled, almost involuntarily from the force of the wind. In that instant, President Cleveland finished his speech in Chicago. His finger touched the ivory button affixed to a solid gold telegraph key that closed the electric circuit to the vast engine. 21 guns fired, and Hornsby screamed, "A cup to the dead already, and hurrah for the next that dies." And then he propelled himself out of the window head first. And with that, I thank you very much. We have 6.5 minutes. Any questions?
Was the game that you were talking about the first football game to use, with the modern rules, to use the pointed football?
It was the first one to use those concessionary rules and to use a rugby ball. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And of course, American football will continue to evolve. Between 1876, later that year is when Walter Camp, basically invented the quarterback position. And so you have a number of evolutionary steps. 1906 really is when modern football was developed, because that's when the forward pass was legitimized in 1906. But yeah, that was this game in Evanston was the first to use those concessionary rules, an actual American football game with a pointed ball, with, well, an ovular, ball, yes.
Why do they call the football a pigskin?
It was made out of pigskin. So initially they were rubber, made of India rubber, and then it was a man by the name of Ludden in Rugby, the town of Rugby, who began using pig bladders and began putting them around leather. Some of that leather was cow leather, some of it was pigskin. Yeah, there's a rumor, and I mentioned in the book, there's a rumor that his wife was the one who had blown up all these pig bladders and ended up blowing up a couple of infected pig bladders and died from infection. Don't know if that's true or not, but ending on a dark note. Thank you for bringing it up. Yes. Yes?
Any relation to Roger Hornsby at all?
No, I looked. No, he's not. That's a good question. Yeah, and Rogers Hornsby thwarted me at every step, because every time I would search, I would always get Rogers Hornsby. But no, he's not related.
Bruce?
I also looked at that. No. I did talk to the few remaining surviving relatives in America, though. Yeah.
So when did the pointed football?
After the forward pass. So you've got the evolution of the football. It was still kind of an oval, even for American college and pro teams that were playing at this time. Once the forward pass hit, you see it start to get narrower and narrower. By the late 20s is where you start to see it become what we would recognize as a modern football. Yeah.
At what point did some of the safety equipment come?
Oh, there was no safety equipment here. This was a brutal sport. And of course, one of the reasons why we had the forward pass in 1906 is because of the deaths that were taking place across American colleges at the turn of the century. So Northwestern stopped playing in 1906 and 1907. Northwestern didn't have a team for those 2 years. And unfortunately, it was those 2 years that really transformed the sport. So when Northwestern restarted, they were already behind the 8 ball, and they've always been behind the 8 ball since. But it was during that time, during that turn of the century, few people wore helmets. Some people wore banana receptacles to protect their noses from being broken. That was about it. So really the first leather padding, a lot of stuffed padding, nose receptacles. Sometimes they would wear ear flaps to protect their ears from being boxed. Helmets really came into vogue around 1910, 1915. Yeah.
Do you have a partner or spouse?
Do I have a partner? Oh, does Hornsby have a partner? I did not mention her, and shame on me for that, but yes, Marie Hornsby, they married in England just before they came over to the United States.
And then how did he get into the suffrage movement that you wrote articles?
Hornsby really was kind of a transformed individual. As a young man, especially as an army officer in the 1860s and 1870s, Hornsby was a very unpleasant human being. Unbelievably racist, unbelievably sexist. It was only after his downfall in St. Paul and going into prison that we see this transformation. And it's an incredible transformation for somebody, especially at that time. To think of somebody who came from a position of privilege And to see them in the 1890s basically do a 180. It was through contact with some of the black inmates at Stillwater Prison, and also the contact that they had had with Frances Willard. Willard and her group had frequent contact with prisoners because of the temperance movement. And because of that, this really meant a lot to a lot of the prisoners at Stillwater. Reading some of their letters, reading some of their articles in the Prison Mirror, they're touched. Like some of them weep openly at the fact that these women are spending time with them and trying to help them. So that was part of that a relatively rapid transformation for Hornsby. But before that, he was, no offense, he was a bastard. He was really, really an unpleasant guy. Yes?
Tell me a little bit more about you. Do you just write about this and that, or are you just a big football fan? Which angle do you have?
I'm a market researcher, actually. Yeah, I used to work for Jim Beam as a market researcher for Beam. I now work for an office supply company doing analytics for them. But my interest is history. For years and years, I had researched the history of Northwestern football and Northwestern sports as a hobby. And again, as I was researching that, came across Hornsby and thought, no one has written a book about this guy. It needs to be done.
Well, you mentioned sports in general at Northwestern. I have a vague memory. Was the first NCAA championship at McGaw?
Basketball? Yeah, it was.
For basketball.
It wasn't McGaw Hall. It was
Oh,
at
McGaw.
McGaw Hall was way before that. It was Patton, the old Patton gym, long gone.
And
But
it's true, though. It was here.
yeah, the first NCAA tournament was held here in the late 30s, and it was at Patton. I don't know much about basketball, so sorry, but that was the closest Northwestern would get to that tournament for decades. Yes. Yes.
Is there anything in your research now that you've been done for a long time? Is there any part of his story or football or anything of that era that you really wish you knew more about, or there's some mysteries out there in your research?
That's a great question. I wish I had more images of Hornsby. Certainly, like I said, we only had 4 images, and you saw 2 of those 4. The other 2 are like Zapruder images, grainy, barely legible photos. So it would be great to have more photos. None of his surviving relatives had images of him. As far as information, I'd love to know what his wife did when he was in prison. I'd love to know what his wife did when he was on the run. He didn't tell his family that he was fleeing. He just left them high and dry. So the St. Paul community, we know their reaction. They were furious, and they were very supportive of his family. But we don't know their reaction. I'd love to know what happened to Marie Hornsby at that time.
What happened? I'm thinking about how you ended this with him jumping out the window on the train. I mean, what happened to him after that?
He was unhurt. Yeah, he was unhurt and kept on trucking and crossed the Mississippi River to flee. They eventually caught him later that evening. But it's a fun story. Yeah. Well, thank you again. Thanks, everyone. And as Chris had mentioned, if you do want a copy of the book, there are a pair up for sale. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Larry.
Thanks.